thank you all very much for coming, especially if any of you are perhaps Russians yourselves or have Russian family or friends who kind of know a lot of what this story represents. Paul has suggested opening with this video, which even for those of us who don't understand Russian, I think it's kind of a beautiful, powerful, kind of moving presentation of the fact that, as you discuss in the book, over 1 million Russians just about the last 2 years have fled, largely in protest or concern out of what's happened to Russia with Putin and the war and everything. It's something in the West we covered a lot in the first few months of the war, especially fall of 2022, when the partial mobilization was announced and 300,000 Russians were drafted in essence, and many left then. But I think it's something that's been left out of kind of the Western media and the Western consciousness since then, that there are over 1 million Russians cast about all parts of the world who felt like they had to flee, or some didn't have a choice, they absolutely needed to.
Right.
Can you discuss why you felt it was important and needed to really write this book? Maybe besides who went and where they went, most importantly, maybe why they went.
Right. Well, I think there are a couple of different categories, but in the first instance, I think just the shock of the invasion, now we're going back to February of 2022, I think that most Russians were stunned, actually, that Putin opted for this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They just hadn't expected that. And so there was immediate calculus, and particularly in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where there was at least a significant minority of people who were actively opposed to Putin, I think they worried a little bit about what was going to happen to them. Some people thought that the borders might be sealed. Mm-hmm. So, for example, one of the persons that I talked to, I found him in Yerevan, in the capital of Armenia. He was a very successful advertising executive in Moscow. I mean, he had a pretty good life there. He had been active, but only really at a superficial level in the anti-Putin political opposition. The war happens, it's like a bell goes off, he jumps into his Mazda SUV with his big fluffy Samoyed, and he just races towards the border with Latvia. He stops to fill a prescription for an anti-anxiety medication. He makes it to the border. He's looked on with great suspicion as a Russian. He attaches some blue and yellow pieces of paper to the back windshield of his car, so it's clear where his sympathies are. Those are his sympathies. And eventually, he actually came back because he thought it was safe. And then you kind of get to a second wave of the Russians when this mobilization was announced. I think in some cases, probably in many cases, there were people who were simply trying to save their skins. I mean, they didn't want to be in the war, even if they didn't have a strong position on why this war was happening. They thought it was wrong, and they didn't want to have any part of it, and they didn't want to die in this war, which I think is a fairly universal thing. I mean, we find that a lot. And so that second wave produced hundreds of thousands of Russians leaving the country. So it's really the biggest outflow from Russia that you'd have to probably go back to the Russian revolutionary times, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people who were leaving during those years.
And sadly, it seems like we've had mass waves of migration from different parts of the world repeatedly over the last 10, 20 years, mm-hmm. 30 years. But unlike what people might typically expect, this is not fleeing absolute poverty or economic deprivation. This is not fleeing because of to avoid the direct threat of, say, an ongoing civil war.
Right.
This is, if you could talk more about it, this is really the cream of the crop. These are some of the smartest, the best educated, the most innovative, the most entrepreneurial Russians. You mentioned, I think, 10% of the IT workforce, all other components of society. Who is it that's leaving? And this is really, truly, sadly for Russia, a brain drain. This is a loss of some of the best of the best, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the high-tech workers, many people just broadly speaking, sort of in the knowledge and culture-producing sectors of Russia, many from Moscow and St. Petersburg, some of Russia's best-known singers, Alla Pugacheva, who was sort of an icon during the Soviet time. She left. That was significant. I mean, that was a blow, I think, to the Kremlin. Her husband, Maxim Galkin, who is a comedian, who is now performing before the Russian diaspora. And it wasn't just Moscow and St. Petersburg as well. It was people. I met many people from Siberia, who had left. People who had worked for Alexi Navalny, who has an organization in Russia. In fact, even though many of those people have gone into hiding, some of those people left. I met one of Navalny's foot soldiers in Yerevan as well, and we talked about that. I met with a young woman who had just graduated and completed her medical training in an institute in St. Petersburg. So, yeah.
And I think your book pushes back, I think, against an unfortunate trope in the West. This idea that Russians are largely conformist. They will accept a strong man, autocratic rule. They're not willing to kind of push back. This is millions of people who you left largely out of opposition. Some of them are still working. Not all of them. Some are working in different capacities outside of it. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the war itself, can you talk about maybe Nastya or some of the other people in the book that you highlight? This idea that some Russians have this enormous sense of almost collective guilt with regards to the war. Another people you highlight in the books, I think you said, it's as if your brother had killed somebody. You did not commit the crime, but your family feels the shame.
Right.
Can you talk about maybe what the sense of guilt is for some people and how that was as much of a motivating force of anything to leave?
Yeah. Well, one of the fascinations of the whole topic for me, just to kind of lead into that, is in one way or another, I've been writing about Russia and Russians for at least 25 years, and probably my fascination began with a teenage reading of Crime and Punishment, and for a middle-class kid growing up in central Massachusetts, that seemed to be quite an exotic sort of adventure into lands that I had not physically visited and certainly had not even mentally conceived of. And so I became kind of attached to Russians as just as a thing to kind of plunge into. One of the great themes in Dostoevsky is guilt, the sense of shame. And the Brothers Karamazov, his last and I think greatest novel, was very much centrally concerned with this notion of guilt and murder and all of those things. And I think it's deep in the Russian culture. So I think that was activated by this war for a number of reasons. I think at one level, there were Russians who felt guilty that they had not done more to oppose Putin. I mean, the invasion takes place in 2022. Vladimir Putin has been in power since the last day of 1999. I mean, that's a long time. And I think many Russians who may not have liked Putin accepted what they described as a kind of bargain or contract, that they would go on with their lives, their personal lives, and maybe they would prosper, and they would stay out of the political arena. That was sort of the deal. You leave that to the Kremlin, and you worry just about, you keep your nose, focused on your family and on yourself. So one of the characters in the book is Nastya, who I met in Yerevan, and she is actually the young medical student from St. Petersburg. She grew up in a region in Russia in the north, Karelia, which is near the border with Finland, in a village. And as she described herself to me, she was just this sort of simple village girl. Her mother told her, you don't want anything to do with politics. Just, just stay out of that altogether. She went to the medical institute in St. Petersburg. That was her dream. She wanted to do a residency in neurology. I mean, we're talking about an extremely committed, curious, intelligent person. When the anti-Putin protests began in St. Petersburg, she wanted nothing to do with them. She knew that would mean her expulsion from the institute. She told me she would rather, at that point, have put a gun to her head than give up her medical degree. And yet, the war struck her conscience. She fled the country. She had just finished her training. She was not even at that point in a residency. She left. She gave it up. She went to Yerevan with her not particularly political husband who was a tech worker. When I found her there, she was taking classes in Ukrainian, as some of the Russians were, and her dream, her vision of her future was pretty uncertain, but she told me that she wanted to go to Ukraine for the first time ever and help restore the country if she could, if sort of she would be permitted. So, that was for me kind of a really striking example of the guilt, the shame, which I think, to go to what you said about the shame, it's a sense of Russia as a kind of family, and so the crimes that are committed are not, confined just to the people who committed them.
And kind of another side of that, I think it's very unfortunate and wrong for any person to ever have to feel a degree of responsibility or maybe even shame just because of what ethnicity they are or because of where they were born or what their heritage is.
Right.
I know I've met some Russians here in Houston who've told me, Ronan, for the first time in my life, I felt hesitant to say I'm from Russia. I might just say I'm from Eastern Europe, or I kind of pass over it.
Yes.
Can you talk about that kind of, I think, really kind of unfortunate and almost cruel, especially for some of these people who are fleeing because they oppose what Putin has done, the way some of them are being received negatively, especially in parts of Europe and elsewhere in the world that they've gone to?
I think there is a stigma that's attached, and some of the exiles I talked to even feel that it might be justified in some sense, but they're also making choices that they feel that they can stand up for. So, for example, among the exiles are journalists who were once based in Moscow mostly, and committed against the war. They left with the invasion. They saw no further role, really, they could play constructively in such a repressive society, where, by the way, a law was passed that even to call the war a war could put you in jail. That was a real threat. So the book has a chapter about such a group of journalists who are associated with the news organization TV Rain, Dost, which broadcasts and is largely a visual medium. They went initially to Riga in Latvia, where a number of the Russian journalists went, and they ran into this problem.
And maybe you could, for people to understand, this is not RT or something like that. This is the complete opposite. This is kind of an open kind of forum, kind of pushing back against, long time history of kind of open journalism, pushing back against, Putin's autocracy, just to let people know who TV Rain is.
So TV Rain was founded by a group of people who were not committed, declared anti-Putin opponents, but who set out to fulfill the mission of independent journalism, basically. And in the years up to the invasion, they had pretty much fulfilled that mission. Some people thought, they might be a little bit light on politics and so forth, but they were trying to do things, culturally, just a great variety of programming. And they ran into the Kremlin a number of times, on some issues. So no, they were not funded by the state. They monetized their operation through subscriptions of people in Russia and advertising and so forth. So TV Rain fled the country. They relocated in Latvia, and then it became an issue with the Latvian authorities because TV Rain felt itself umbilically connected with Russia. They were part of this larger Russian community. So when they talked about Russian troops or the Russian government, they would say, we, that was the pronoun that they used. And the Latvian authorities objected to that. And, you cannot say we, you have to say they. And a number of these kinds of issues cropped up. Ultimately, their license was revoked, and they've now relocated in Amsterdam. And I think it's a shame, just on a sort of policy level, because there's an opportunity here, I think, in the West, outside of Russia, to support the exiles that are now could be considered part of the anti-Putin, anti-war opposition. TV Rain is doing all of its work in the Russian language. on the YouTube channel, its most prominent medium, which surprisingly is actually open in Russia. I mean, Putin has not shut down YouTube, and there are also other social media channels, including Telegram. And so, as I see it, there's a real opportunity here to penetrate into the Russian consciousness among people who might be interested and don't only want the sort of propaganda that Russian state television is feeding them, and yet they're in this, in certain countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, they're seen as undesirables.
One of the more fascinating chapters in here, it goes back to some of the equally intriguing and kind of sometimes very cynical history of the Russian Orthodox Church leadership being co-opted by the Kremlin during the Soviet era and collaborating oftentimes with the KGB. Some high-level people, members of KGB.
Right.
Can you talk about the role of the church, especially in the years of Putin, how the Russian Orthodox Church again has been kind of co-opted by the Kremlin? There are those pushing back against it. We'll talk about that afterwards.
Yeah.
But in terms of the role that the Patriarch Kirill and his, kind of lieutenants have in terms of promoting this idea of a new Russian nationalism, a new and legitimized and even theologically justified kind of Russian imperialism.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that during the Soviet time, the church was largely, although not always at all times, repressed, the Russian Orthodox Church. And I'm persuaded by the history of this and what's come out in the archives that there were people in the KGB who felt that that was a big mistake, that they shouldn't have taken such a sharp turn, the Communist Party, against the church, because it was just a natural expression of religious and spiritual feeling on a lot of, lay Russians. So, so why do that? I think when Putin came into power, there's a whole story, his mother had him secretly baptized, all this sort of stuff. I don't know. Maybe all of that happened, but I think the point is that unlike Yeltsin, who, even though he nominally embraced the church, he was not liked by the church. He was seen as a drunk. He was seen as sort of a weak leader. The church historically has supported autocracy and aligned itself with autocracy. So a bargain was basically made, certainly led by Putin, to kind of reintroduce the church as a pillar of his rule, really. And the church, I once spoke with a father not far from the old KGB headquarters in Moscow, the Lubyanka, who was told to me that he was the person to whom Putin confessed. And I don't know, but it was an interesting conversation. And he said that Putin was assuming the rightful role as the first face, the prvia litso of Russia. And that church, in turn, when the Patriarch Kirill came into power, which was during Putin's reign, they concocted this notion of Ruski Mir, which is Russia world, which is basically the notion that this Orthodox Russian civilization consists of Russian peoples wherever they are found, which includes Ukraine. And under this construct, Ukraine, in the origin story of Russia, is the first Rus in Kiev. Vladimir was baptized in Crimea. I mean, Putin visited this baptismal site. I think this is a neglected story in the West. I think Putin is often wrongly associated with the idea of just reviving the USSR, whose collapse he has described as a tragedy. But I think it misses the point that he's really more of a traditional white czarist type Russian, and I think the affiliation with the church points that out. In return, the hierarchy of the church has embraced the invasion of Ukraine and has called it essentially a sacred mission. But if you want me to get into it, there's a dissident strain inside of the church.
I think maybe briefly you could talk about Father Alexander Men and kind of what he represents to his tragic case, what he represents to the kind of the open, I suppose, and compassionate and just kind of, I would say, more truly kind of Christian priests working within the Russian Orthodox Church who aren't looking to be influenced or connected to the government, just doing their mission, caring for their people and the poor and the sick.
Yes.
Maybe you could talk about Father Oleg, and I suppose how doubly tragic it is for someone like him. He hasn't just lost his country. Even in exile, since he's been forced out of the church, he's lost his calling. He's no longer able to, even in exile, work in a church and be recognized, accepted, and work as a priest, right?
Right. So, yeah, well, when I was in Georgia, I took the train from the capital of Tbilisi out to Batumi, which is on the furthermost western shore on the Black Sea, to meet with Father Oleg Batov, and his wife Maria. In the Orthodox Church, in the Russian Orthodox Church, the priests are permitted to marry. And I got his story, which was a very interesting one. I mean, he, at one point, was a very sort of prestigious priest in the system. He had his church paces from the Kremlin, on Red Square. His wife had a prominent position. She was a musicologist and sang, at one point with the Boston Camerata. I mean, they had this, this sort of good life, but the war did it for them as well. I mean, thou shalt not kill. I mean, there's nothing in the Gospels about Ruski Mir. I mean, this is all kind of political at some level, having nothing to do with spiritual matters. And so in their story, what I discovered was that their hero was this very charismatic figure, Alexander Men, who was a priest in the Soviet time who, even though the Bible, you couldn't just go on the street and get a Bible or even go into a church, there were gatherings of the faithful. Mm-hmm. And Alexander Men was one of the sort of charismatic people who was looked to, and he believed in a people's church, without the gilded domes and all of that, and just as you described, the traditional mission of the Gospels. And he had a flock, and he threatened someone because in 1990, just as he was making his way along a little path in the woods to get to the railway station, somebody came up from behind him and split his head open with an axe. Mm-hmm. It was a famous murder at that time, 1990. Nobody was ever found, but the axe is kind of a traditional symbol of Russia, the Russian peasant. I mean, could have been the KGB, it could have been some Russian national, we don't really know. But in any case, that powerfully influenced Oleg and Maria. So I found them, they had fled the country, they were pitted against Putin. Maria told me that absolutely she did not see, Putin as a real Christian, no matter what he professed, publicly, and even if he had a confessor. Oleg is driving a taxi and doing, tour guides and things like that, and Maria was giving private music lessons to kids and adults, that sort of thing.
And you mentioned in the book some of the missed opportunities, and people might associate this million or so who have left with the intelligentsia, the new, modern, well-educated Russia, mm-hmm. Some of whom may be secular, but there is a propensity not to be willing to work with or think about somehow collaborating with people like Father Oleg or others who are truly just kind of good, decent, Orthodox, faithful in different parts of Russia. Can you talk about those kind of missed opportunities with regards to the church, but maybe more broadly of the opposition working with each other?
Yes. Well, I think it's one of the curses of exile movements that they often fragment, and they find it difficult for various reasons. It can be ego, it can be a clash of mission and purpose. In this case, you have sort of different centers of power and influence. I mean, the Navalny group, I think, is number one, even though Alexi Navalny is in prison in Russia, in northernmost Russia, a very remote place. He has an organization and a team and lots of people who are dedicated to him. But as they see it, they're going about their own business. They don't really want to cooperate with other exiles, groups including those Gary Kasparov or Mikhail Khodorkovsky. They also have their own sort of acts, and they in some ways have more standing in the West than they have inside of Russia. There have been efforts to hold united congresses and those kinds of things, but the Navalny people have refused to participate, basically. So I think that has to some degree frustrated the effectiveness of the exiles, that they all profess similar things. They want to end the war. They want to get rid of Putin. They believe in various iterations of a democratic, perhaps a parliamentary republic. Mm-hmm. They don't support autocracy, all of those things, but they haven't really cohered as a group. And tragically, that's happened in Russian history before. All of the whites that left after the Russian Revolution, they did not really, they dreamed of the Tsar one day returning, but that never happened.
And maybe to look at the kind of the most extreme representative, because I definitely don't want people to think it's the core or anywhere close to a large percentage, but there are some of those Russians in relations to the Ukraine war, mm-hmm. who have taken an active role in support of Ukraine.
Yes.
Maybe you could talk about Mikhail, who works with technology to help bring down some of the Russian drones.
Yes.
And even beyond that, there are some Russians who have some of these legions or kind of militias people might have heard about who actually have gotten into combat directly against other Russians. Can you talk about that and how that complicates how the opposition or those who have fled are viewed maybe by ordinary Russians outside of Russia and especially back home?
Yeah, so this is a very controversial issue within the Russian exile community. Even though it's one thing to say you're opposed to the war, it's another thing to say, well, what exactly am I going to do to try to stop it, other than sort of rhetorical statements. So I met Mikhail, who was a member of what was known as the anti-war committee. We met on Zoom. I think he was probably in Munich that day. Mikhail is a really brilliant Russian physicist type. He's sort of maybe Elon Musk. He has all kinds of ideas. I mean, even as we speak, I think it's a hypersonic plane of some sort of the other. He's always working on something. He grew up in Siberia, and he's a committed Siberian nationalist. He thinks Russia, many people think this, is just too large and cannot be governed, from the top, from Moscow, and it should be broken up. So even as he was pursuing his career in science, he was also getting deeply involved in politics. And at one point, this was before the invasion, he left. He wrote an article in support of Siberian independence and was visited by security service people. He knew he was on their watch list, and he left the country. So when the war breaks out, he combines with this friend who's a Ukrainian physicist on developing an anti-missile defense system using sensors, basically, and radar to detect incoming drone and missile attacks. When I met Mikhail, it was on a Zoom call, and he kind of impishly grinned and said, "I have something to tell you." So what is that? He holds up a sheet of paper, which is an award that was given to him by the Ukrainian ground forces for his contributions to the Ukrainian war effort. And it was just, he's absolutely committed to this cause, and I haven't spoken with him lately, but, well, let's just say I hope that he's in good shape.
And beyond, that's a scenario of defensive measures, mm-hmm. Stopping drones that might be, attacking combat units or even civilians.
Yeah, he would say he was clear about this, and I want to make this point. When I asked him about that, he said he was saving Ukrainian lives, not killing Russians. To your other point, which I didn't get to, there are Russians, it's hard to say exactly how many, but who are part of a Free Russia Legion inside of Ukraine. They managed to get there by one way or another, and they have been organized by the Ukrainian military to fight against Russians. So there is a civil war aspect of all of this, whether it's rhetorically or with real bullets. I also, in Yerevan, ran into a young anarchist, a little Kropotkin, who's 19 years old, something like that, who, told me he was working as, I think, a bicycle messenger boy, collecting his savings and converting them into Bitcoin and sending them to underground anarchists inside of Russia who are doing things like ripping up railroad tracks. And it's credible because he pointed me to articles in the Western media that covered this and showed photographs of ripped up railroad tracks. So I'm sure the prize is to get to Putin's train, which I think has many, many layers of armor. But, you know, this has not be the first time in Russian history, let's just say, that the head of state, you know, got blown up by an anarchist.
And I suppose the justification for some of those you had spoken to, what it might seem to outsiders, like how could you do this against your own country? Someone to paraphrase said to you, you know, Putin stole our country from us.
That was Mikhail.
We're just fighting to get it back, right?
That's the way they feel about it. And I think, I mean, you cannot underestimate the depth of hatred that exists between, you know, the Putin camp, as it were, in Russia and these more politically motivated exiles. I think a lot of it is missed in the West because it's conducted entirely in the Russian language and it's not covered extensively by the Western media. But, you know, Putin hates these people. He calls them scum. They hate him. Putin is now trying to extend his repressive rule to the exiles themselves in the diaspora. He's been pressuring, or the Kremlin has been pressuring countries like Thailand and Indonesia, Dubai, from allowing Russian performers, entertainers, to perform, you know, because they're anti-war. And the Kremlin recently, or I should say the parliament, passed a law that would allow for the confiscation of property of exiles who were deemed to be basically enemies of the state.
You touched upon, you know, some of the awful language Putin uses for, you know, anyone really in opposition.
Anyone.
Scum. He talks about kind of in terms of almost, you know, communist type ideology, the idea of self-purification,
yes.
Of getting rid of anyone of an ideology that might, you know, counter the state. In the short term, if 1 million plus people have left the country of about 140 million, and 1 million plus people have left, many of whom were the people who might have been the most ardently anti-Putin, anti-autocracy, most willing to push back, in the short term, has it maybe actually helped make them that much more stable within the country?
I think it's possible. I mean, he would probably look at it that way. I mean, since the war, and I think gradually, because he didn't really start out this way in his reign, which, you know, we're now talking about, what, 24, 25 years, he's become more and more sort of aggressively anti-Western in his rhetoric and anti-NATO. And so he is able to sort of describe these exiles in opposition as sort of part of that, you know, group that is now affiliated with the other side, which is the West.
Yeah.
I mean, he just, you know, when he looks at Ukraine, he basically just says, oh yeah, that's just an extension of the West. That's really who we're up against. So that's the way that he defines them. But I think he is threatened by them, or otherwise, you know, why these repressive actions against the diaspora and so forth. In the short term, I mean, there are Russian nationalists who have, in some ways, in fact, who regard Putin as too weak, who are rejoicing that these people have left the country. They do see it as a kind of purification and a reconstitution of, you know, what it really means to be Russian. But I think this game has a long ways to play out. One of the aspects of this uprising or rebellion, as we might call it, is a generational one, which, you know, harkens again to a lot of, you know, traditional Russian themes. I mean, Turgenev, fathers and sons. I mean, you have a group of younger people who will outlive Putin. Yeah. You know, he's what, 71 right now, so he's not going to live forever. He'll die in office, out of office, but there will be a post-Putin Russian future. So I think for those playing the long game, the way to look at it is to be prepared for that moment.
Obviously, the question everyone who covers Russia gets asked, but it's impossible to answer, and it's purposely is impossible to answer. You know, Putin's 70, almost 71 now?
I think he's 71.
He's been in power for almost a quarter century. At some point, even he might step down or retire.
No, I doubt that.
But that may, if that does or does not happen, outside of a collapse of the regime, if it's Putin Part 2 or Putin Light, someone staying from within his circles.
Yeah.
Obviously, if people remember what happened, Yevgeny Prigozhin over the summer.
Yeah.
Most people are probably not willing to say, I would consider running for president when he retires, because your plane might happen to crash.
No.
But is there anyone you see as a potential, not I would say threat, but just a successor to him within the current kind of regime?
No, there's nobody that I see who can play that role. I think there are people who are part of this, they call them the Siloviki, the men of power, who have backgrounds that are similar to him, who are typically people drawn from the security services. In Russia, the military has not traditionally been very political, so you don't usually get a threat like that. The Prigozhin threat was really quite unusual, and he wasn't a standard military leader. He was sort of this mercenary warlord type who had gathered some gang of mercenaries around him. So that wasn't, although it's possible Prigozhin had some support within the Russian military. I don't think we really know that for sure. But no, I don't think there's really anybody inside of Russia right now that threatens him. I think if Putin, when Putin goes, however he goes, sort of like when Stalin went, I mean, there was just this kind of mad scramble. I mean, nobody knew what was going to happen. Yeah. And the people who come out on top are usually not the people that it's predicted will come out on top. I don't think many people predicted that Gorbachev, years later, would prove, would be effectively the head of state. No, I don't think so. So my take on Russia is generally every generation or two kind of gets an opportunity to change things. And we thought that could happen with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a moment, maybe, when Russia could have taken a better turn. And for all kinds of reasons, I think too long to discuss, some of which in which I think the West is complicit, it didn't happen, and Putin came on as almost like this Thermidor-type figure, a figure of reaction, who consolidated and got rid of certain things that the Russians didn't like the oligarchs, or at least the oligarchs who were not aligned with him, put in his new class of oligarchs. So it's complicated. I don't think any of us can really say what a post-Putin future will look like, but I think the exiles, the more politically minded of them, are correct to prepare for a post-Putin moment, and also just to be a custodian of, values that are, worth observing for Russia, because in an autocracy, and there's so much propaganda, it's very difficult for the people inside who are only listening to that to have a sense that there could be a different kind of Russia. So I think, if nothing else, the exiles are playing that sort of custodial function. And it has to come from Russians. Other people cannot. This is a dialogue and a fight between Russians.
And related to that, I know some of you already have it, but if you have any questions for Paul, my colleagues are passing out those question cards. You mentioned in the West, we maybe overplay the power influence of someone like Mikhail Khodorkovsky or some of the oligarchs who, in reality, for most Russians, both in Russia and outside of Russia, they're kind of a hated class, seen as extremely corrupt and made billions based on the backs of stealing from Russia. Not all of them, but that's some of them.
It's a perception, yes.
Perception. But in terms of the leader, opposition figure most of us know, can you discuss maybe what are the kind of your perceptions and realities of Navalny? And if not Navalny, are there any other opposition figures you would say to maybe also kind of keep an eye on?
Well, I think Navalny is the obvious one because, after his poisoning, when he nearly died, he went to Germany, and then he made this sort of heroic and defiant decision to return to Russia, which has made him a kind of a living martyr, but also I think has established him, at least in the Russian people's mind, as a brave figure. So I think he's really, for that reason, number one. In his organization, it's kind of, the woman who's now in head of his organization, Maria Pevchek, she's really known as a kind of investigator. She's the one who was behind the Putin's Palace set of investigations, which exposed this enormous, palace in the Black Sea region, and supposedly all kinds of corrupt monies were poured into it and stuff. So Navalny is focused quite a bit on corruption, which I think is the theme that a lot of people inside of Russia can identify with. I mean, they're used to it, but nobody can be happy with a society which seems so much, kleptocracy seems to be one of the defining conditions of it. So I think opposition figures are able to profit from that. And there are some younger people that I kind of have my eye on, but I don't think anyone at this point has really emerged over Navalny as somebody that people, the opposition could, really rally around.
And in terms of if it's Navalny, like you mentioned, he is in Russia, but he's in a form of exile.
Yes.
In a remote prison away from access to anybody.
Yes.
It's not always the case in history with any form of change of regimes or revolutions that a leader from exile is able to come in and fulfill that role of leadership. But it does happen. Even Russia, Lenin and Trotsky.
Lenin on the sealed train.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
a good, a salutary example or not.
Another train, but definitely. Do you think that it will be possible for an opposition figure in exile to come back to Russia and actually have legitimacy if they have not been in Russia for a while, that they could kind of take over a role if Navalny, for instance, is not able to?
I mean, I think it'll be tough, but I think there are people who have not, first of all, who are not so much attached to this sort of oligarch past in the way that Khodorkovsky is, and he's in his 60s anyway. But I mean, one of the most impressive people I met, who's now in exile, is Sergei Guriev, who was the provost of Sciences Po in Paris, and he's about to become the dean of the London Business School. And he's the kind of person you could imagine to be sort of a prime minister in a post-Putin Russia. I mean, really wise. He's very well connected in the exile community. He's not one of the people that is sowing division, just the opposite. He's an economist by training, very rational, sort of results-oriented kind of person. So yeah, I think there are a number of people that are like that. I mean, there's not a government in waiting, although there's been talk about that, but they're not able, I think, to unite around the idea of a government in waiting. So at best we can identify people who might have some role, some influence in a post-Putin Russia. But again, I think it's early days for that. I mean, Putin is still with us. The war has not ended. Yeah. There are a lot of things, that are unresolved.
And I always love great questions from our students. You touched upon it a bit, but maybe you could follow up on it. It's hard to predict. But Anna from the Audi School asks, if anarchists or anti-Putin groups are successful, what do you think would be the most likely political landscape for Russia from there, kind of going forward? And would you see a parliamentary system, or what would you see as possible, like you discussed?
So there are a lot of people who have thought about this and who think that there was a mistake made with the collapse of the Soviet Union in creating what is essentially a very strong presidential system in Russia, and who desire to have a more parliamentary type system, such as you see in most of Europe, and also those who want a more federated system, almost like you see in Switzerland, say, with cantons. But it's an undetermined question. I think the tendency, and frankly, one reason that Navalny, at least in the past, has had his detractors was because he did have a sort of a populist coloration, and there were concerns that he could lean himself in an authoritarian direction. So I don't know that Russia, I'm not a determinist. I don't like to think of Russia as just this place that is somehow doomed to recapitulate, autocracy forever and ever. But because Russia is so big, it's so difficult to govern, that the tendency has been to centralize power at the top. And so even in a post-Putin future, and even if, the new head of state was not drawn from the pro-Putin camp, you would still have that tendency, at least.
Two questions I'll put together. There's one kind of domestic, one kind of foreign, but similar vein. Bethany, another great student from the Audi International School, asks, Are there any major transnational groups outside of Russia that present a strong threat against Putin? And Julio asks, indirectly related, are there any findings against separatist activity in the southern regions, say a lot of the ethnic regions of Russia where people are not ethnic Russians, where the largest number of casualties have been taken?
Well, that's a great question. Not really aware of any of the transnational groups that have really organized as a threat to Putin, but this idea, right now, Putin is reluctant to resort to a second mass mobilization because he understands that the political consequences are not going to be favorable to him. So the government, the military, is doing a lot of its recruiting in fairly remote areas of Russia, and particularly among non-ethnic Russian communities, and it's paying bonuses, for example, substantial bonuses for people to sign up. Way more than they might make in their job, let's say, over a year, and promising death benefits as well. And so that's a lot of what you've seen in terms of who's going to the war. And I think there is a potential there for some kind of, a political restiveness the longer this war continues, and given how, the cost of the war has been distributed in the way that it has. And there's another dimension that's connected with that, which is that traditionally in Russia you have seen opposition to a prolonged war from the mothers and wives of the sons and the husbands that are there. In this case, we're seeing some of that because the boys and the men who've been mobilized have not been rotated out for a very long time. And they're wondering why. It's not even so much an anti-war question. It's just why are they the ones who are having to do all the sacrificing? Where are the fresh recruits? So I think Putin understands that there's a latent kind of threat there the longer this continues.
And just for the sake of time, I'll kind of combine these and just, I know it's hard to make these relatively quick, but I'll just combine two of these and then two more to finish. Lee asks, when do you think exiles will reach a critical mass or critical loss to the Russian society in terms of that impact? And then maybe related to it on ideological sense, Maxim asks, as recent events showed, there was large support for Boris Nadezhdin. Sorry, my Russian is horrible.
Okay. It's okay.
Do you think if anybody with a strong supported idea can become a leader, kind of this idea that if it's not Navalny, is there an ideology that people can kind of really focus around?
Yeah, well, so Russia is having a presidential election in the middle of March. Vladimir Putin's on the ballot. I think he can be safely expected to win. But this character, Boris Nadezhdin, whose name in Russian is sort of a root for the word hope, is trying to get on the ballot. And what's significant there is in order to get on the ballot, you have to have people who will sign petitions, basically, to put him on the ballot throughout Russia and all the different regions. And it appeared that he has accomplished that, something like 150,000 people or so. And this is significant because people had to publicly put their names forward, including details of their passports. So they are known to the Kremlin now as people who are willing to put their support, at least to be on the ballot, to have a choice for Nadezhdin, who is avowedly anti-war. And so we'll see whether he actually gets to be, on the ballot or not, because the Kremlin could try to restrict him. I'm sorry, what was the other part of that?
The other part was related. Oh, I can't remember. It was, at a certain point, do you think exiles will reach a critical mass in terms of, the damage in terms of their loss to the Russian society and economy?
So I think that that's probably already happened, because I don't think that there are big new waves of exiles. In fact, what's happening now is that some Russians are feeling discouraged in exile because whether they're having their savings are meager, or they're worried that they're not getting the kinds of jobs that they want many academic. Ronan and I had lunch today with such a person who visited with Russian in exile academic types in Germany and elsewhere, and some of them are going back because they can't get appointments to their positions in these host countries, and so right now I think we're in a kind of an in-between moment. However, if Putin was forced to do another mobilization, I think that would activate a new wave of exiles, because we've seen that in the past.
Maybe just and there are two or three I didn't have a chance to get to, but I'll definitely give them to Paul.
Okay.
But maybe just in terms of looking at it from the United States' perspective, maybe the West in general. Agatha asks, what do you think will happen if we have a change in administration in the United States? How it impacts a Russian exile community, the Ukraine war, and maybe more broadly, do you think that the United States and, say, Europeans should do anything kind of more directly in support of the exile community, or that would itself be seen as a way of delegitimizing them in the eyes of many Russians?
Yes.
Because they would just say, you're just American puppets. Like,
right.
How do you see the U.S.'s role and Europe's role going forward?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and I think, I think a couple of things. I think in terms of the U.S. role in Washington, I think that we should stand through diplomatic exertions in favor of allowing Russian comedians and performers and so forth to perform in countries like Thailand and Indonesia and something, because one of our values is freedom of expression. So why shouldn't we? And I don't think that would delegitimize these exiles if we're simply saying, no, we don't think that the Russians should be able to dictate that. And it's also something we did during the Cold War as well. We stood up for Russian dissidents. We stood up for Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We stood up for all kinds of people who were in exile. I think in this case we have not, because it's a more complicated situation with the Ukrainians, who understandably have grabbed our attention, and the tragedy there in Ukraine has consumed the West, has consumed the European capitals and Washington, and so there just hasn't been that much focus on the exiles. But I do think more can and should be done. I wouldn't be in favor of for example, like direct U.S. government aid to exiled Russian media outlets. I would think that that would immediately be seized on by Kremlin as, oh, you see, it's what we told you all along. They're just part of the hated West. But that doesn't mean, private philanthropists could give to such organizations and so forth. I don't think that would compromise them. If there's a new administration, I think that's kind of a euphemistic way of asking what would Donald Trump do about Ukraine and Russia. Well, I take him at his word, as in so many things. He has a relationship with Putin that he regards as constructive and cordial. So I think he would probably sell the Ukrainians out.
All right. And just again, just
in a heartbeat.
Okay. One chance kind of last comments, but if any of you want to keep up with Paul some more, maybe you could tell them a little about your podcast.
I have a podcast. I'm glad you asked.
Sure.
On the New Books Network. It's called American Beyond, and it's meant to be very civilized. I like to talk to people with ranges of views, including on Russia, but on many different subjects, as long as they're not, just dogmatists, as I told you. So yes, I invite people to check that out, and I want to thank everybody for coming. And
lastly, like I mentioned, we have Paul's excellent book in the back of the room. He'll be signing them very kindly. I highly recommend it if you want to learn a lot in a nice, easy format. Some of these people write 500- and 600-page books. I think they don't realize most people. I have to read them, but most people don't have the chance to read them.
You can read it in a weekend.
Yes. Maybe just any last thoughts you'd like in terms of the Russian exile community, kind of the overall outlook for Russia. Not to be predictive, but maybe just any last sentiments you'd like to leave us with.
No, I hope people won't, give up on Russia, because it's easy to, given that they so frequently disappoint. So I think I welcome anyone who's just interested in immersing themselves in this area, and I have found it rewarding, after all my years. Although it can be very frustrating to be a Russia watcher, but it's a challenge, and I invite everyone to just stay engaged.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we have Paul's excellent book, Putin's Exile, at the back of the room, and thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking Paul Starobin. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
That worked.